I grew up in Wisconsin, in a series of very small towns, ending in Toma, where I went to high school. And then I left for like 40 years, and I recently returned. So I'm in Milwaukee now, and I've had this great opportunity to spend time here at the university, and I love it. So so the class I'm teaching is called Human Rights, Latin American Advocacy. It's a very broad title, but I decided what I wanted to do with this class is to try and help the students think about how you think about advocacy. So that's kind of my goal for this class. And I thought I would share with you one of the sessions that, well, part of one of the sessions that I'm doing with the students. It's a problem that is near and dear to my heart and that I've been working on for a very long time. And that is, that I'm kind of stuck on at the moment. So I also like to talk about things that I'm stuck on because maybe someone will have a really good idea. And it's migrant kidnapping and extortion.
You're fine. I'm just going to try to turn the sound down. So
Let's see. How do I go on to the next? I don't control the screen, right?
Just tell Jacob and
yeah.
he'll do it.
So the problem is this, that, and this is not a new problem, but the problem is that migrants, as they're making their way to the United States, often in Mexico, are kidnapped, and their families are, extortion payments are demanded of their families. Now, the families can be back in their home countries, but they're often in the United States. That's often who the kidnappers are going for. And this is a really, it's a problem almost nobody seems to know about. And B, even fewer people do anything about. But it's also, if you're in the middle of it, it's incredibly traumatic for both the people who are being kidnapped and for the families who are trying to figure out how to come up with money to pay the kidnappers and who really have nowhere to turn, at least here in the US. So, so that's the basic problem. Really brief history. So going back to the dark ages, like the 1980s, there was actually not that much drug trafficking going on at the US-Mexico border. There was marijuana trafficking, but that had been there forever. And, but in the 80s, the US government decided to clean up Miami, which was a hotbed of cocaine trafficking at the time. And so what they did was deploy a lot of resources and did get a shift in the transit of drugs into the United States. And the shift was that that instead of bringing cocaine in over, by water, they started bringing it in across the border, the US-Mexican border. I bring this up because there really wasn't a lot in terms of organized crime on the Mexican side of the border. When I say the border, I'm talking about the northern border, unless I mention differently. So there wasn't that much organized crime, but that started to change. And it started to change because of this decision by the US to clean up Miami. So that was really a critical moment. So over time, the whole drug trafficking patterns changed between South America and the United States. You'll remember the Colombian cartels were really big for about 2 decades and controlled most of the trade. And then the trade started changing, and the Mexican cartels kind of took over the role that the Colombians had been playing. But then also the criminal organizations started atomizing much more. So there would be, it wasn't like just one group took it from start to finish. There would be all these separate organizations, criminal organizations. So there's been a lot of morphing in terms of what the presence of organized crime looks like on the border. And there are also occasionally conflicts between the criminalizations for the territory that they control coming into the US. And that territory is usually known as plazas. So whoever controls the plaza controls access into the U.S. markets. And when those battles are going on between the criminal organizations, it tends to be when it's the most violent and the most people are getting killed at the border. So we started working on this at WOLA back in the a little before 2010. I make reference to the San Fernando massacre. We were working on this before then, but we were working on it because we had set up in the 2000s a program on border security and migration. It was a combination of both the parts of our office who worked on military and security issues and the parts who were working on Mexico and Central America, because what we were seeing was this real change in what was going on. And so to be able to set up this new program, we established relationships with the Casas de Migrante throughout Mexico. Back then, there was not the infrastructure that exists today on migration, but there were Casas de Migrantes, a handful of them. I don't know, so we had direct relationships with, 6 or 7 of the Casas. So we would get regular information. We would travel there. We had, these weren't formal agreements, but we were exchanging information and kind of in regular conversation. So we knew that these kidnappings were happening. That's the point. And we came to the issue from the Mexican side, not from the US side. So the San Fernando massacre was an incredible wake-up call to everybody working on migration issues in Mexico, because it was so incredibly brutal. Basically, 73 migrants were taken off of buses in Tamaulipas, in the state of Tamaulipas. They were all killed except for one person who escaped and who then told the story of what had happened. For years and years after, they were identifying the bodies and trying to prosecute the case. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I could. There's a lot to tell. Again, working with our counterparts in Mexico, we were trying to figure out what you could do in the United States, because we were always at WOLA, we were always looking at the intermestic angle. So what's the connection between the domestic and international side of things, right? Because my view on advocacy was, my responsibility was with my government and the actions that were taken here. And so if I'm working with colleagues in other countries, they're working on their responsibility with their governments, and then we're trying to see where how collaborations can be effective. So one of the things that we actually did was work with the Mexican consulates in the US to get them to provide a protocol for people to report these crimes. Because you'll hear a lot more about this in a second, but one of the principal problems with this issue in general is that the crime isn't reported. And the crime isn't reported for a bunch of reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But that's, at this stage, that's what we did. We worked with the Mexican consulates. We came up with a protocol. We had a bunch of discussions with the FBI and with Homeland Security. After working on this for a couple of years, I think, we decided to set it aside because the way we identified it at the time, we were setting it aside because if people reported into the FBI, nobody at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, where ICE is located, no one could guarantee that the reporting person could get any kind of immigration relief or protection. And so there was no incentive for anyone to report the crime. So again, we set that aside. And then when the Biden administration came in, and there was a little more, that's a whole nother story, but there was a little more openness to working on some of these issues, and there was more funding available to work on some of these issues. A foundation asked me, what's not being done? There are tons of people working on things. What is not being done? So I came back to this issue. We can move along to the next slide. So the big question has been the scope of the problem. How big is it really? Let me grab some notes I made here. At this point in time, one other thing before I get to that, where we've seen kidnappings happening has morphed over time as well, along with the criminal organizations. You now see some kidnappings happening in the Darien, although it tends to be a really different phenomena and it's very different criminal organizations. It's stuff that's localized there. The northern border is, I would say, predominantly where you see it, but you see it in other parts of Mexico as well. And then in my class last week, we had Emily Green, who works for ProPublica, the newspaper, the press outlet. And she's recently done a story on how almost everyone crossing into Chiapas from Guatemala right now is being kidnapped immediately. Immediately they're turned over. But it's a different kind of kidnapping because they're all being kidnapped and they have to pay $75. So they're like taken to a farm somewhere and they got to come up with $75 and most people can come up with it. So this usually, they're detained a really short period of time unless they've got nothing. And then that becomes a different set of problems. But so there's a new piece in the kidnapping phenomenon. So back in, let's see, when was it? I think 2020, the Mexican National Human Rights Office, again, scope of the problem, they estimated that about 70,000 people had been kidnapped between 2011 and 2020. That's a guess. No one really has a clue. But what that tells you is that it's not 10. This is a problem that has impacted tens of thousands of people, if not, I suspect, a lot more. I'll get to that in a minute. So it's so hard. Why is it so hard to measure? It is, and who does it impact? At different times, it's morphed as well, because there was a time when Cubans were it was popular to kidnap Cubans because they were thought to have a lot more resources because most of them had family in the United States and they were coming through Mexico to get to the US to their families. So a lot of Cubans were getting kidnapped. Now it's less, that kind of dynamic and more a volume business. So it's just much, much more common. People get kidnapped in central Mexico, but at the northern border, what you see is, back when in the earlier days when we were working at this, and even in the past, 5 or 6 years, one of the complaints was with our counterparts in Mexico was that people were getting kidnapped as soon as they got deported from the US. So they would, because they would show up at a designated hour on a bus with a whole lot of other migrants. And they're very identifiable because they all have a clear plastic bag with their, whatever is left of their belongings. And no one has shoelaces because they're all taken while you're in detention. So it was really easy to see who the people who were getting deported were. And in some places like Nuevo Laredo was really known, or Reynosa, I think, well, probably both at different times, but like the 5-block area right around the port of entry was like that was a zone you had to get through because you were just a sitting duck there. Then came, there've been so many stages in all of this. During Remain in Mexico, the time when under the Trump administration, they were keeping people, and later, they were keeping people in Mexico while their political asylum cases were being heard. It meant that the volume of people who were just hanging out in the border region was much higher. And it stayed that way for a long time. Allows business to develop a little bit better. That has been really problematic. But now, so here's how it works. Um, uh, you're coming up through Mexico, say you make it to Mexico City, and then you're taking a bus up to the northern border. Pretty much, if you are going to cross over into the United States, you're going to have to pay off a criminal organization. And if you don't, like if you get stopped and if you get stopped and asked for money, they will, if you can pay them, they'll give you a code, clave, they call it. And that code only applies to the criminal organization that controls the area in which you're in. This is important because say you end up in the US and you get deported back at a different port of entry, you're in the territory of a different criminal organization. So even though you might have paid them off once, you didn't pay them off over here. So it all gets kind of complicated. But basically, once you have the clave, they're supposed to sort of leave you alone. So because it means that you've paid up. So the clave works in different ways. The clave is often, that can be just for crossing over into the United States, but also if you've paid off a kidnapper. The kidnappers are, the just crossing into the US is a much smaller amount of money. The kidnappings can, and they take people off of buses, they pick people off streets, from taxi drivers, from people who are offering help. It happens a lot of ways. It happens outside of the migrant shelters. The amount the kidnappers ask for can be like 15,000, or it can be, a couple thousand, 1,500. It varies a lot. And I'll get to more on that in a minute. But it is, back to my point, because I got off track here. It's incredibly hard to measure because no one reports this on the Mexican side. And they don't report it on the Mexican side because they're afraid that the criminals are in cahoots with the police. So there is not much of an incentive. Sometimes something gets reported because something really bad is going on. But this is kind of, how business operates these days. And so people just don't report, even though really horrible things can be happening to these people while they're being held. But so on the Mexican side, it is incredibly difficult to measure how many people are getting kidnapped. Again, I threw out that one number from the government, but no one really knows. And then if you have someone who's kidnapped, I was talking to somebody who runs one of the shelters in Matamoros, who was saying, well, if he had a serious kidnapping situation and the family reported it or came to him, that he knew the way he handled it was that he basically knew who in the local police was a problem, and that he couldn't go through that channel. So if it was something that needed to be pursued, he would jump over and go to somebody he knew in the national government who might intervene. Or might figure out how to get the system to intervene. Occasionally, and you'll usually see these on the news, large groups of people are freed in Mexico. And, the police will do a raid, a bunch of people are freed. Sometimes they're deported as soon as they're freed. And sometimes they're taken back to the migrant shelters. So again, like the protocols around all of this are, they don't really exist. So it's very hard to get the government to respond. Also, the fact that this is not true in every city on the Mexican side of the border, but in the Tamaulipas region, which is large, in South Texas, bordering South Texas, the criminal organizations there are really serious, and it's very dangerous. Even for somebody who wants to do the right thing, it's incredibly dangerous. The people who run the shelters, the one I talked to might be a little bit of an anomaly. Usually the way they deal with kidnapping is they don't. That they've decided that that is the kidnapper's business, and that the only way they can keep helping migrants is if they stay out of it. And that's the general way it's dealt with. Okay, we can jump on. So in terms of advocacy thinking about this, I went through the first stage we did of getting to know the shelters within Mexico, beginning to understand the problem, talking to US authorities, talking to Mexican authorities, talking to consulate people, coming up with a solution that didn't really work. As I came back to this just a few years ago, I realized that, and I have a tendency to do this, to try to address problems at their hardest point, and that's might not be the most effective way to go about this. So I started doing a ton of interviews, again, along the border. I went along the border, I interviewed all kinds of people on both sides, trying to figure out how to, do something different, and to try and figure out how big the problem was. I have bits and pieces of information, some of which I'll get to in a second, but, I could identify, one time I got a shelter that was moving from one location to another on their entry survey to ask people if they had been kidnapped. I mean, it gave me like a picture of a really small piece in time is what you could get, and you could extrapolate from that. And I don't remember the numbers exactly, but they were big. But it didn't, I wasn't getting where I needed to be. So at the same time, I was having a ton of discussions with people in the US government. That included, so when I was at WOLA, we did some work with this one office in the Justice Department. It's in the FBI, and they're the people who go after like war criminals who got into the US by lying on their visas, that kind of thing. They've gone after some war criminals from Latin America. And anyway, we had a relationship with this office. So I started talking with someone there and about this problem, which really bothered her as well. So she was trying to figure out, again, how to be helpful. So we were in discussions both with her, with other people within the Justice Department, with DHS, with the State Department, with Homeland Security, it should say HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, which would be the body within Homeland Security that would investigate this kind of thing. We had group meetings where we brought them together. Interestingly, they didn't know each other, even though technically they all deal with parts of the same problem. And then there was during the Biden administration, they set up something called Task Force Alpha, which was, it doesn't try to get attention. You can't find out very much about it, but basically they've been going after traffickers and migrant traffickers. We were talking to them too. So from there, we get down to this problem of reporting of the crime. We keep coming back to the problem of reporting of the crime. I mean, there are a lot of other things to be dealt with here, but there you have it. Can we go on to the next one? So, reporting of the crime. So then I thought, okay, so I've been here, I've interviewed all these people on the border. I can't make much progress by trying to figure out how to work on the Mexican side. It's too dangerous. It's too hard to do from there. But the victims on the US side, these families are the victims of extortion by criminal organizations, right? And so I got to figure out where they are. But I got to tell you, I've asked around a lot, and it's not like people just come out of the woodwork to tell you that, they've been the victim of this kind of extortion. So I told some people on the Mexican side of the border that I wanted to kind of get in the middle of some kidnappings, not physically, but that if somebody wanted to report the crime, because this is big, because most people don't, but if they wanted to report the crime and they wanted the help of the FBI, that I would try and figure out how to help them. So I get this call from a guy we'll call Danilo from Texas. And I'm using this as an example because it really tells the story. So he had gotten my number from somebody on the Mexican side, and he was near Dallas. he had been contacted by 5 members of his, well, by a criminal organization in central Mexico. They were holding 5 members of his family, including his wife and 2 small children. And during the course of the days I was talking with him, they would send videos of his, I think it was his brother-in-law being beaten, and it was ugly, really ugly stuff. So I called my colleague at the FBI, and I said, okay, because we were discussing all of this all along, right? So I said, okay, I have a live case. That's the other thing. You would, to get the FBI involved, it's like I needed a live case. It had to be while it was actually going on. Otherwise, I don't know. It was too hard to get them to deal with it at all. So I had a live case. So she said, okay, here's what you do. You have him call the FBI field office that's closest to where he is, which is the Dallas field office. So he makes the call. Again, the really unusual part here is that this guy is even dealing with me, right? He calls the FBI field office, and they say, it was a Sunday, and they actually said there was no one there who spoke Spanish who could take his call. I am not making that up. So then he calls me back and said they wouldn't take my call. They said nobody spoke Spanish. So I called the FBI woman again, and I said, okay, well, so now what do I do? She said, okay, now he should call the local police, because the local police are trained in how to escalate a reported crime, not escalate it, but take it to the appropriate authority, right? Relevant to the crime. So he calls the local police, who told him, this is a crime in Mexico. You need to be talking to the Mexicans, not to us, and wouldn't do anything. So at least they had someone who spoke Spanish. Yeah, so that was the end of that. So then he calls me back again, right? And you have to remember that this guy's he's calling me back and forth, and his family is being beaten on live video, and that's being shown to me. And it got worse than that, but I mean, it was really traumatic for him. So I call the FBI woman again, and by the next morning, she had found somebody in the FBI who would talk to him in Dallas, which was not the normal way it's supposed to work. But in this particular case, they heard his story. They got in touch on the Mexican side. The Mexican anti-kidnapping unit in that part of Mexico ended up getting involved. All this, took a fair amount of time, and this guy's panicking the whole time. And I'm pretty sure that the end result was that he paid off the kidnappers and they were released. And then, then there was some trying to figure out how to get them somewhere where they were safe. But I think it's a good story because it shows the whole difficulty of the problem. So then, this is my last long example. I'm known for telling stories that take too long. So again, that wasn't working. The whole getting in the middle of the kidnapping thing, it was really hard to do. And so I was trying to come up with another way to approach this when I just got in touch with this one guy who was in the Immigrant Affairs Office in LA County. And he was somebody who had worked in an NGO. He knew what these cases were because he had experienced them on the US side. And he thought it was a really interesting idea, wanted to be helpful. But he said, for me to sell it, within the institution he worked in, he needed to understand the scope of the problem in LA. So I said, well, I can't tell you what that is, but I will come out there and talk to everybody I can think of. And he helped me talk to a bunch of people who probably wouldn't have talked to me otherwise. And I'll tell you what I find. So I did. I went to LA, talked to, the police, church people, service organizations, people who work on trafficking issues, local officials, I mean, kind of everybody I could think of. And then I went down to San Diego. Most people come through there if they're going to LA. And I talked to a guy in the FBI who had broken up a kidnapping operation, who had helped break one up in Tijuana a couple of years before with the Mexican police. And I'll get to that story in a second. But basically, here's what I found. That I found a handful, but very few cases where somebody knew or somebody had reported that this was going on. Now, that said, at the same time, you know, I don't know what I interviewed a dozen people, like 4 of them could tell me personal stories they knew of where this had happened. So it was like there is a complete disconnect between what's on the official level of what's going on and what seems to be actually going on. And then by the time I got to the FBI guy, he said, yeah, when we were working on this case, you know, there was one case that we were pursuing, but when we, you know, raided when the, you know, the Mexicans raided the place in Mexico, he said they found a garbage bag full of IDs. So, I mean, there were a garbage bag full of IDs worth of victims with that one, in that one case. So the point I came to with the County of LA people was this, and actually somebody who worked in the state office really helped me with this. And I do think that this is how you can get at this problem if anybody really wants to in the future, which is she had worked for her entire career basically on violence against women and getting the cases prosecuted, right? Domestic violence cases prosecuted. And she said, if I go back to when we started working on this, the first problem is no one reported the crime. So you had to create a venue for the crime to be reported. There had to be a channel, and there had to be some kind of a positive outcome that would come on the other end. Because why report it if nothing's going to happen? So she said, you know, it took years, but you got people reporting the crime. And then, you know, and then you got the police to respond, and then you had to get the justice system to respond. And then the police weren't really good at operating within the justice system on these cases. So you had to get them, you know, trained to do it. But she said, you know, over decades, it's really changed. But she said, your first problem is there has to be a venue to report. So I proposed to the LA County people that they, not like establish a new office or anything, but like assign a human being and not a 800 number, where somebody who could take these calls and channel it to the appropriate authority, if it be the local police or the FBI or HSI, somebody who actually knew what to do. So you didn't have the Danilo problem of I call places and nothing happens, right? And you do an education campaign in the impacted community, which I don't think could be that hard or costly. You could do it in ways that I think would be effective. So that people know that if they're the victim of this, this is where they report. And that somebody is at least trying to help them, even if they can't be offered immigration relief. You know, I think they really liked the idea, but the funding they thought was going to come through didn't come through, and so it ended up not happening. So this was kind of the last, my last route on this. Let's see what's left here. That's something. I just threw this here at the end. We're going to open up for questions right now, but you can't really see that very well. I love this poster. This is a poster that was created. It's actually related to migrant deaths at the border. So it's a poster that was made by, it's made based on the things that were collected from cadavers that were found from the remains of people. And there was one office in the coroner's office in Phoenix where they were collecting these items. And so basically they just, between a certain period, they counted them all. And then a graphic artist made this poster out of how many items and what different kinds of things were with people. Anyway, it's a good one. But I will, I always share that because I think I have it in my office and I look at it all the time and I see different things all the time. Yeah, so that's what I have for you today.
So we have plenty of time for questions. If you are on the chat, feel free to type your questions and I will say them. We'll moderate that way. Questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
So this is probably a really hard question, but obviously we're only like not even a month into our new administration here in the US, but I'm wondering, obviously a lot of the work that you reported here is utilizing offices here in the US government that are perhaps not as strong as they were, or they're, being weakened. And I'm just wondering where you see this going and like what the ramifications might be.
Well, they're not doing anything now, and they haven't been, so I don't see there to be a great change at the federal level. I think that if anything on this starts to move, it's going to start to move at a local level. So, that's why I was really interested in the LA County piece, because you're in California and there is kind of this, I mean, they're part of the United States, but they have their own domestic laws and they have their own domestic attitudes there that are quite different. Yeah, I think it would be on a local level. Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that it was really helpful to listen to the presentation because I could think about angles and avenues. So it seems to me that, I mean, these are the same organizations that are criminal organizations trafficking drugs ostensibly, right? Or some, maybe not. Okay. Because I was thinking, like, rhetorically, potentially an avenue to get action, at least on developing a venue to report, would be to suggest that having better documentation of the moments where this is happening then creates the possibility to understand where the network is, where the nodes of activity are, and potentially who's doing that. So I wondered about that. Like, would that be an argument to?
Okay, so I'm going to be a real bummer here because
okay,
but also I'm really trying to work this out,
yeah.
Right? What I would say to that is a fewfold. Where the criminal groups operate and who's in charge of what territory and who's doing what is not a mystery.
Okay, so that's already known.
It's known.
Okay.
And if somebody wanted to deal with this problem on the U.S. side, the way to deal with it on a kind of technocratic level is to follow the money, because people who have had their family members kidnapped actually kept like the receipts of the bank transfers. They know the place that it goes to. I interviewed at one point a guy who worked for Western Union about this, and he said, well, people who work here know this happens, but they don't want to get in the middle of, they don't want to suspend a payment that's going to get somebody killed. So that's a little self-defense oriented. I mean, so they're not doing anything about it basically. But he also said, look, we can look at the transactions that take place to places, and we can spot the anomalies of the transactions that tell us where it's likely happening. So I am convinced this is not a question of information. It's a question of political will, and that it's a really difficult thing. The other thing that's getting, I think that at some point will impact how people understand what's going on at the border, is that, the big thing crossing the border these days is fentanyl, right? The big item of concern. Fentanyl crosses it crosses at official points of entry. It crosses with U.S. citizens generally. This stuff has been documented. And in very small quantities. So it's not like, I've heard some people estimate that migrant kidnap, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard some people estimate that the migrant kidnapping stuff is actually producing greater revenue right now for the criminal organizations on the Mexican side than drug trafficking. Now, I don't know that that's true, but I don't know that anybody can disprove it either, because this is such a, again, yeah. Coming up with data here is a real challenge.
In your opinion, to what extent is the kidnapping problem linked to like the restrictiveness of immigration policy and like securitization of the border? Like, if you were able to, I guess, is that what is driving people to have to go through like coyotes and everything?
Well, migration happens for tons of reasons, right? In terms of securitization of the border, one reason I started with the 1980 example is that I think the piece of history, and I didn't explain this well, because I think the piece of history we often miss is that as we increased, built the wall, increased the level of Border Patrol agents, massively over a number of years, those things happened at the same time as the criminal organizations consolidated on the northern border in Mexico. So as we thought we were making ourselves more secure by securitizing the border, we helped create what was going on just south of there, or it certainly didn't stop it. So that's one relationship I think all of this has to security. I don't know. It's so many people have tried to figure out what to do about criminal organizations, the criminal organizations in Mexico and other places. Even what's going on in Ecuador right now, or Venezuela, or we can go on and on. Colombia became somewhat different when the Mexicans took over, basically. So the strength of the criminal organizations within Colombia became less, as well as there being prosecutions. It's always it's never one thing. It's a bunch of stuff that has to kind of come together at the same time. Yeah.
So I did interviews with a number of Venezuelan migrants currently residing in the United States this past summer. And while the focus of the interviews wasn't on their journey, I did ask them sort of contextualizing questions to understand what that was like. And almost unfailingly across the interviews, everyone cited the experience in Mexico as like the real
worst
inferno, right? Like not the Tapón de Darien, like not in South America. No, it was Mexico, right? Because they had almost all been extorted and kidnapped at some point. And it seemed like in a lot of cases, like folks were still reeling from, psychologically and sometimes physically from some of the traumas that they endured during those experiences. And I'm wondering if you might know of like any, organizations that might offer some like support addressing like issues of like post-traumatic stress and other kind of like things that manifest from.
There are some in Mexico who have, psychologists nowhere near the scale of what women need to address these problems. I did some work for an organization who I will remain nameless, but in the U.S. that was really concerned about children migrants and, setting up child-friendly spaces and shelters and things like that. And I just kept thinking and saying, if you really want to do something for these kids, you would try to keep them from getting kidnapped while they were coming up, because the impact of that versus the impact of having somewhere for them to color is you're kind of not. One of the things I've been saying in my class, and I will say over and over again, is how you define the problem defines the solution. this is a horrendous problem. And the long-term implications of it on this next generation of people who have come is, you can't discount that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. When you were describing the practice of some of the criminal organizations in Laredo, giving people a code
Mm-hmm.
to indicate that they had paid out.
Mm-hmm.
It just really struck me that feels like, that reminds me of how states behave. And I remember years ago reading a book about, undocumented violence in Houston, and one of them described what was then the INS as the biggest coyote around. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts of that?
Why did they say that?
Well, I mean, because, it seemed to this person like, I give this person money, they give me, they let me go across the border, what's the difference? And I guess I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts about the state-like quality of this behavior by the criminal organizations?
Yes.
I mean, there are some people out there who do think states are essentially organized crime.
Yeah. I think that there are also people who think, there are people who argue that Mexico doesn't have territorial control of some areas. I think that's true. On the other hand, it's not like it's stateless. It's a different reality than, it's a really complex reality. And I've talked to enough Mexican officials over time to know that, like, even if you have a really good governor that gets elected somewhere, if you're in a place like Guerrero or Michoacan or Tamaulipas, actually doing something that challenges the structure of the criminal organizations is really tough. I mean, there was just a mayor elected in Chilpancingo in Guerrero in Mexico, and Guerrero has been, I mean, basically, there's been the presence of criminal organizations, and I would say probably the military in cahoots with the criminal organizations. I mean, they've been eradicating the same, poppy fields for decades. So I think that's, there's some collusion that has to be going on there. But anyway, this mayor who was very outspoken that he was going to do something about this was beheaded days after he was elected. It's not, this is a really tough thing to deal with. And you have to have, it requires incredible political will, and it requires basically the federal government, the state government, the local government, all to work together on something that is really, really hard and dangerous. And you have to be able to prosecute people. Once you prosecute them, you have to be able to keep them in jail. It's it's really difficult. But there are other parts of Mexico, like, I love Mexico. I just want to say there are other parts of Mexico that have very little presence of this. It's not like it's the whole country, or that it's all the same everywhere, or that you can't operate in some of these cities like Reynosa or Nuevo Laredo. And if you're just going about your daily life, well, if there are shootouts, it does impact your daily life. But there are parts of society that are physically in those locations that do not engage with these problems.
So the alternative example of the domestic violence I thought was a really fascinating one. I'm wondering if the VAWA protections play a part in that, and I wonder if that's then instructive to think about immigration protections that are a part of the answer to this. So, because it made me think of, could a U visa or a T
Yeah.
visa be applicable in this
Yeah.
context, or maybe a different type of visa? But certainly the VAWA protections,
Yeah.
I think maybe did something. So
You define it.
yeah, so the Violence Against Women Act, a part of that act in 1994.
I don't remember.
I don't remember when the year was exactly, but it meant that or immigrant women who were in the U.S., regardless of status, who were in a relationship with a spouse, a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, who were abusive, can receive immigration protection on the basis of that, if they report it, if they work with police to do this. So this is a really powerful form of immigration relief that I think probably changed the landscape of a lot of contexts. So like, I was just curious about, like, do you think like those forms of immigration protection are
Yeah.
maybe a part of?
I really looked at this in LA.
Yeah.
So like things I was hearing in general, not specific to the LA thing, I'll get to that, but was that there aren't very many U visas.
Yes,
And so-
log is like.
Yeah, and so if it's again, if you're dealing with somebody in the moment of a crime, you can't promise anybody a U visa. And so it's like not all that helpful. A U visa is for, somebody who's a victim of a crime and is willing to testify. I thought that, where there is a mechanism to respond to something that parallels the kidnapping experience is trafficking, right? And there is the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I think. Under the TVPRA has been very popular with Republicans and with Democrats. It's like it's very popular and it's well funded. So I was thinking, well, if I look at the kinds of services that are provided to somebody who's reporting trafficking, like I've been trafficked, it's, they have a phone number. It's published all over the place. Someone gets on the phone, they talk to them. There's an exchange that starts back and forth. People are actually helped to get out of this situation, right? And there is a structure funded to deal with that. Whenever I talk to people who worked within the TVPRA, ecosystem, they are very protective of not expanding the definition of what they do. And so that was like, don't tread here, was the message I was getting. I think they think if it gets expanded, then their significant support won't be as great. So that was one. And the other, darn it, I was going to make another point. I interviewed a guy who was he was with the Department of Labor, like on the West Coast, or some guy. Anyway, he was telling me that, that again, how you define the problem defines the solution. He says, you are defining the problem incorrectly, and that you should define the problem as wage theft. Because, stay with me, no, was it wage theft or it was, no, it would be considered forced labor. That's what it was. If someone actually had to do labor to pay off the extortion payment, so it was it would be involuntary labor, and then it would come under trafficking, I think. Yes. And he said, that's how you should be talking about this. I barked up that tree for a while. When I went back to Washington, I talked to people and, who are in that world, and they said, nah, that's not going to work. And I can't remember the technical reason why, but they didn't think, because I think the easiest solution to the problem would be to try and funnel some of these cases into a system that already exists. But so I guess the advocacy message is that solving problems is hard and takes a really long time.
Folks, we have maybe time for one more question?
I have one question about, I think it's very interesting to see how criminal organizations like adapt like other businesses and also make alliances and work in different countries. I am from Colombia and I am curious about like the explanation that you did about the Colombian case because we hear in the news all the time that there is more cocaine than ever in Colombia. And also we have this situation between the ELN, this guerrilla group, who is possibly making alliances with the Venezuelan government. So it's interesting for me to see how these criminal organizations depend not only in the context of Colombia, the context of Venezuela, but also what you were explaining about what is happening in Mexico and how powerful this kidnapping business criminal organization is in relation to drug trafficking. So I would like to hear in this minute, like, any more thoughts that you might have about the Colombian case.
Well, I think you're completely right that all those things are true. You know, more coca is being grown. There, you know, lots of reasons behind that, including less enforcement, including, I'm not saying enforcement makes a lot of sense, but, you know, when you go and you eradicate coca out of one area, I mean, this has just been documented all over the place, that people who are producing it, if they're subsistence farmers, tend to move and then produce in a new spot. But after a year, the previous land recovers. So after a period of time, you end up having exponentially more coca than you did before you start eradicating. And there's less focus in this administration on, you know, on forced eradication in Colombia.
Yeah.
So that's you know, the amount of coca. You know, when I think about Colombia, well, there was a long history of criminal organizations, I mean, like drug trafficking organizations working with the FARC, and what was the line between them or the ELN, and, you know, how do you make those distinctions? But what you don't see in Colombia anymore is like criminal groups taking over the justice, you know, it's a different violence, and it's a different sense of control, right? It doesn't mean you can be in places that seem completely, again, this is one of the things that's kind of mind-bending. You can be in places, I'm sure this is true in Colombia, I know it is in Mexico and parts of Central America, that you know, because you've seen the data, are seriously controlled by criminal organizations, and yet there is no violence or very little violence. And it's because one group tends to control the territory. They have decided that that's the best way they function. They have paid off whatever officials they need to allow things to operate without you know, problematic behavior. Again, it gets back to the question of what problem are you trying to solve? If you're trying to solve the violence problem, there are one set of solutions. If you're trying to solve the criminal organizations operate here problem, it's really tough. It's hard. I'm sorry, my time is up.
Folks, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us.